They say the swamp still whispers his name. Jonas Holt, the quiet slave who never raised his voice, never fought back. He just watched. And one night, he slipped his chains without breaking a single link. The masters thought it'd be easy. They sent a handful of trackers first, then dozens, then a full 100 bounty hunters armed with dogs, rifles, and swagger. Men who bragged they could bring anyone back in chains. But Jonas wasn't running. He was waiting, deep in the Carolina marsh, where the trees hid his footprints, and the darkness moved like it belonged to him. One by one, the hunters walked in, and one by one, they vanished, into traps built from a lifetime of pain, a mind shaped by cruelty, and a swamp that answered only to him. Because Jonas wasn't just escaping. He was rewriting the rules of survival. And if one man can outthink 100 armed hunters, what happens when the entire militia comes for him next? Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The fog came first, like it always did, gray and heavy, clinging to everything. It rolled across the yard in slow waves, turning fence posts into shadows and making the ground slick with dew. Clark pushed through it, boots squelching in mud, heading toward the work sheds where morning roll call happened every day at the same time, rain or shine. He carried a brass bell in one hand and a ledger in the other. The bell was for waking, the ledger was for counting. Simple routine. He'd done it 1,000 times. But today, something felt wrong. The air was too still. No sounds came from the sheds. No coughing, no shuffling of feet, no quiet murmurs people made when they thought no one was listening. Just silence, thick and waiting. Clark stopped walking. He squinted through the fog and saw the door to the far shed standing open. Not broken, not forced, just open. He walked faster. When he reached the doorway, he saw them, the shackles, lying in the dirt like someone had carefully placed them there. The iron cuffs were open, not broken, and the chain between them lay straight as a line drawn with a ruler. No scratches, no blood, no torn fabric, just empty metal. Clark crouched down and touched the shackles, cold, damp from the fog, but nothing else. He turned them over in his hands, checking for damage, for anything that explained how they'd been removed. The lock mechanism was intact. Someone had opened them properly, like they'd had the key. But Clark had the only key, and it was hanging from his belt right now. His chest tightened. He stood up and scanned the area around the shackles. No footprints leading away. No disturbed dirt. Nothing. Jonas Holt, he said aloud, though no one was there to hear him. He turned and walked quickly toward the main house, bell forgotten, ledger gripped tight in one hand. The fog seemed thicker now, pressing in from all sides. He climbed the steps to the wide porch and knocked hard on the door. A house servant opened it, eyes wide at seeing Clark so early. "Get Mr. Holt," Clark said. "Now." Minutes later, Silas Holt appeared in the doorway, still buttoning his shirt, gray hair uncombed. He was a tall man, lean and sharp-angled, with eyes that always looked like they were calculating something. "What is it?" Silas asked. "Jonas Holt is gone." Silas stopped moving. His fingers froze on the last button. "Gone?" "His shackles are lying open in the dirt. No sign of struggle. No damage to the restraints." Silas pushed past Clark and walked down the steps, moving fast despite the fog. Clark followed. They crossed the yard together, boots kicking up moisture, and reached the shed where the shackles still lay exactly as Clark had found them. Silas stared down at them for a long time. He didn't touch them, didn't crouch like Clark had, just stood there, staring, jaw tight. 10 years, Silas said quietly. 10 years he's been here, and he never once tried to run. "I know, sir." Never caused trouble, never raised his voice, just worked and watched. Silas turned to Clark. and there was something uneasy in his expression, something Clark had never seen before. You ever notice the way he looked at people? Clark nodded slowly, like he was studying them. Exactly. Silas kicked at the shackles, sending them skittering across the dirt. Too calm. Always too damn calm. I told you he thought too much for a field hand. What do you want me to do? Silas turned in a slow circle, scanning the yard, the sheds, the tree line beyond. Gather every tracker we have. Get Reese and his dogs. I want a team in the swamp, within the hour. Yes, sir. And Clark? Silas looked at him directly. Bring him back alive. I want to know how he did this. Clark nodded and left quickly, already running through the list of men he'd need. Reese would be easy to find. He lived in the quarters near the kennels. The other trackers were scattered, but they'd come fast if the pay was right. By mid-morning, a team of 8 men stood assembled in the yard, dogs straining at their leashes, noses already working the air. Reese was loud and confident, talking about how easy this would be, how no runaway ever made it more than a few miles before the dogs caught the scent. Clark said nothing. He just watched the tree line and thought about those perfectly placed shackles. They picked up the trail within an hour, footprints in soft mud, heading east toward the deeper swamp, broken reeds marking a path, a scrap of fabric caught on a branch. The dogs pulled hard, eager and focused. Reese grinned. Panicked runner. See how sloppy the trail is? He's scared, moving fast. We'll have him by nightfall. But Clark wasn't so sure. He crouched beside one of the footprints and measured the spacing with his hand. Even. Deliberate. The stride length never changed, even when the ground got rough. This doesn't look panicked to me, Clark said. Reese waved him off. You're overthinking it. Dogs don't lie. They moved deeper into the swamp as the day wore on. The air grew thicker, hotter, harder to breathe. Insects swarmed in clouds. The ground turned softer, wetter, pulling at their boots with every step. By the time the sun started sinking, they'd covered miles. The trail stayed clear the whole way, almost too clear. Clark's unease grew with every marker they found. This wasn't the path of someone running scared. This was the path of someone who wanted to be followed. As darkness closed in, Clark ordered them to make camp in a small clearing near a cluster of cypress trees. The men built a fire, ate cold rations, and settled in for the night. The dogs lay panting near the flames. Reese leaned back against a log, confident as ever. We're close. I can feel it. Tomorrow we'll have him. Clark didn't answer. He stared into the fire and listened to the swamp sounds. Frogs, insects, the distant splash of something moving through water. Somewhere out in the darkness, unseen among the tangled branches and hanging moss, Jonas Holt stood perfectly still. He watched the firelight flickering in the distance, watched the men settling in, thinking they were hunters. His face showed nothing. No anger, no fear, no satisfaction, just calm, patient observation. Morning came cold and quiet. Clark woke before the others, muscles stiff from sleeping on damp ground. The fire had died to ash sometime in the night. He stood and stretched, scanning the clearing in the weak pre-dawn light. That's when he saw them. Footprints, fresh ones, leading away from their camp in a clear line, pressed deep into the mud near the water's edge. Clark walked over and crouched beside them, touching the edge of one print with his finger. The mud was still wet, still soft. These tracks had been made recently, within the last hour, maybe less. But that was impossible. Jonas had left the plantation a full day before they'd even started tracking. He should be miles ahead by now, not circling back to walk past their camp in the darkness. Clark stood slowly, following the line of prints with his eyes. They led straight into the deeper swamp, perfectly spaced, each one clear and deliberate, like someone had walked through on purpose, wanting to be seen. "Reese!" Clark called out. voice sharp enough to wake the sleeping men. Reese jerked upright, blinking and confused. "What? Look at this!" The other men gathered around the footprints, whispering to each other. Reese pushed through and stared down at the tracks, frowning. "Fresh," one of the trackers said quietly. "Can't be more than an hour old." "That doesn't make sense," another man muttered. "We've been following him east all day. Why would he double back?" Reese waved a hand dismissively. "Probably another runaway. Someone else heard Jonas got out and decided to follow." Clark shook his head. "Same boot size, same stride, same everything." "Then he's tired," Reese insisted. "He's been moving for 2 days straight with no rest. He's making mistakes, leaving obvious trails. That's good for us." Clark didn't respond. He turned and looked back toward the direction they'd come from, then forward again at the new tracks. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't name it. The prints were too perfect, too deliberate. Like someone had walked through the mud specifically to leave a message. "Get the dogs ready," Clark said. "We move now." The men packed quickly, nervous energy replacing the confidence from the night before. The dogs picked up the scent immediately, pulling hard on their leashes, eager to follow. Reese grinned and said something about easy money, but his voice sounded forced now, less certain. They moved deeper into the swamp as the sun rose higher, turning the fog to steam. The ground grew softer with each step, sucking at their boots. Cypress trees closed in on both sides, their trunks thick and dark, their roots twisting up through the water like fingers. The trail led them into a narrow channel barely wide enough for 2 men to walk side by side. Moss hung low from the branches overhead, brushing against their faces. The water on either side was black and still. Reese's lead dog stopped suddenly. The animal planted its feet and whined, pulling backward on the leash, trying to retreat. "What's wrong with him?" Clark asked. Reese yanked on the leash. "Don't know. He's never done this before." The dog whined louder, ears flat against its head. The other dogs began whining too, all of them pulling back, refusing to go forward. Clark looked ahead down the channel. He couldn't see anything unusual, just more trees, more water, more shadows. But the dogs wouldn't move. "Send 2 men ahead," Clark ordered. "See what spooked them." 2 trackers exchanged nervous glances, then moved forward cautiously, rifles held ready. They disappeared around a bend in the channel. The rest of the group waited in tense silence, listening. Minutes passed. No shots, no shouts, no sounds at all except the constant buzz of insects and the distant croaking of frogs. "Should have heard something by now," one man muttered. Clark cupped his hands around his mouth. "Report!" Silence. "Try again," Reese said quietly. Clark called out louder. "Report your position!" Still nothing. The remaining men shifted uneasily, gripping their weapons tighter. Clark made a decision. "We go forward. Together. Stay close." They moved as a group, boots splashing through shallow water, eyes scanning the trees on both sides. The channel bent slightly to the left, and when they came around the curve, Clark stopped so suddenly the man behind him nearly walked into his back. There, balanced neatly on a fallen log in the middle of the channel, sat both men's gear. Rifles, powder horns, hunting bags, canteens. Everything laid out carefully, organized by size, completely dry despite the damp air. But the men themselves were gone. Clark walked forward slowly, studying the arrangement. No blood on the gear, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle anywhere. The rifles hadn't been fired, he could tell from the undisturbed powder. The hunting bags were still packed with provisions. "Where are they?" someone whispered. Clark picked up one of the rifles and checked it thoroughly. Clean, loaded, ready to fire. He set it back down exactly as he'd found it, and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, the water, the thick undergrowth. Nothing. "Maybe they went to scout ahead," Reese suggested, but his voice was shaking now. "Left their gear so they could move quieter." "Both of them," Clark said. Without a word, one of the younger trackers started backing away, shaking his head. "This ain't right. This ain't natural. He's playing with us." "Shut your mouth," Clark snapped. "He's right, though," another man said. "Jonas knew we'd come this way. He wanted us to find this." The young tracker's breathing got faster. "I'm not dying in this swamp for no runaway slave. I don't care what they're paying." He turned and started walking back the way they'd come, moving fast, nearly running. Clark caught him by the shoulder and spun him around. "You run! You're finished! No pay! No work! No one will hire a coward! Better broke than dead!" Clark slapped him hard across the face. The crack echoed through the trees. The young man stumbled but didn't fall. He stared at Clark with wide, frightened eyes. "We stay together," Clark said slowly, looking at each man in turn. "We stay focused. Those men probably fell in the water, got disoriented, wandered off. The swamp does that, confuses people, makes them lose direction. We find them, we all go home. Understood?" Murmurs of agreement, but no one looked convinced. They spent the next hour searching the area, calling out, looking for any sign of the missing men. Nothing. It was like they'd simply vanished, leaving their gear behind like grave markers. Miles away, deeper in the swamp where the water ran dark and the trees grew so thick sunlight barely penetrated, Jonas moved through the undergrowth with practiced silence. He carried a small bundle of reeds and moss, carefully arranged. He stopped beside a game trail the hunters would find eventually and placed false markers, broken branches, disturbed mud, a torn piece of cloth that matched what plantation workers wore. His movements were precise, methodical, each marker placed exactly where it needed to be to guide the hunters deeper, further from safety, closer to the paths he'd prepared. He never hurried, never looked nervous, just worked with the focus of someone who'd spent years watching, learning, memorizing every detail of how trackers operated. When he finished, he straightened and looked back toward where he knew the hunting party was still searching. His expression remained blank, unreadable, the same expression he'd worn for 10 years while working under chains, watching overseers, studying the men who thought they owned him. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing behind but the false trail he wanted them to follow. By late afternoon, Clark made the decision. They were heading back. The missing men had spooked everyone too badly, and pushing deeper into unfamiliar territory felt like walking into a trap. "We go back to the plantation," he announced. "Get more men, better equipment. Come back prepared." The relief on the men's faces was obvious. They turned and started retracing their steps, moving faster now, eager to reach open ground. They'd walked maybe half a mile when Reese stopped and pointed up at a cypress branch hanging over the channel. "What is that?" Clark followed his gaze and felt his stomach drop. 2 hats. The missing men's hats, hanging from the branch by their chin straps, placed deliberately side by side, perfectly positioned where the afternoon light would catch them. Dry, undamaged, waiting to be found. Clark stared up at them, his hands beginning to shake. Around him, the other men started backing away, whispering prayers, making signs against evil. The hats swayed slightly in a breeze that wasn't there. Clark stood in Silas Holt's study, still wearing mud-caked boots from the swamp. He'd ridden through the night to make this report, and exhaustion made his shoulders sag. Behind the heavy oak desk, Silas listened with growing irritation, fingers drumming against polished wood. 2 men vanished, Clark repeated. No bodies, no blood. Just their gear left behind, arranged like someone was sending a message. Silas leaned back in his chair. "You're telling me one runaway slave outsmarted an entire tracking team?" "I'm telling you what happened." "What happened," Silas said slowly, "is that your men got lost in unfamiliar territory, probably fell in the water, drowned, got eaten by something. The swamp's dangerous. That's all this is." Clark shook his head. "The gear was dry, organized. Someone placed it there deliberately." or the current carried it onto that log. Both rifles, both packs, both canteens, all perfectly arranged by size. Silas stood abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. I will not accept that Jonas Holt, a field hand who spent 10 years in chains, has somehow become a ghost in the swamp. You're jumping at shadows because you're tired and scared. I'm telling you what I saw, and I'm telling you to shut your mouth about ghosts and messages. Silas walked to the window overlooking the plantation yard. Dawn light showed workers already moving toward the fields, heads down, silent. Do you understand what happens if word spreads that one escaped slave can make trained hunters disappear? Every worker on this plantation, on every plantation, starts getting ideas. Clark said nothing. Silas turned back to face him. We're bringing in real professionals, men who track runaways for a living, veterans, former soldiers, people who won't panic at the first strange noise. How many? As many as it takes. Silas moved to his desk and pulled out a ledger. I've already sent messages to bounty hunters in 5 counties, offering triple the normal rate. They'll come. Clark felt something cold settle in his chest. You're sending an army after one man. I'm sending enough men to ensure Jonas Holt is brought back in chains, or brought back dead. I don't care which. Silas dipped his pen in ink and began writing. You'll wait here. Rest. Eat. When the hunters arrive, you'll brief them on what you saw, but you will not, under any circumstances, suggest that Jonas is doing anything except running scared through a swamp he doesn't understand. Clear? Yes, sir. Good. Now get cleaned up. You look like hell. By noon, the next day, they started arriving. First came the local bounty hunters, hard men with scarred hands and cold eyes who'd been catching runaways for years. Then came trackers from further counties, some traveling 2 days to reach the Holt plantation. Former soldiers showed up, men who'd fought in border skirmishes and knew how to move through hostile territory. They filled the yard, checking weapons, comparing notes, bragging about past captures. The noise was constant. Boots on dirt, dogs barking, men laughing and cursing and making wagers on who'd find Jonas first. Clark watched from the porch, counting heads. 70, 80, 90. More kept coming. By late afternoon, nearly 100 men crowded the plantation grounds. Silas emerged from the house, clearly pleased with the turnout. He called for silence and addressed the assembled hunters. You all know why you're here. Jonas Holt escaped 2 days ago. He's hiding in the swamp, probably scared, definitely desperate. I want him brought back alive if possible, but dead is acceptable. Triple pay for the team that finds him. Cheers rose from the crowd. Men slapped each other's backs, already spending the money in their heads. Clark stepped forward. Listen to me. Jonas isn't— Thank you, Clark, Silas interrupted smoothly. I'm sure these experienced professionals appreciate your concern, but they know their business. A few hunters laughed. One older man with a gray beard called out, We've done this before, boy. One runaway ain't nothing to worry about. Clark tried again. He's not running. He's leading people where he wants them to go. The trail is too obvious, too perfect. He's— Enough, Silas said firmly. He turned back to the hunters. You'll move in rotating units, 10 men per group, spread out to cover more ground. The swamp is large, but not infinite. Someone will find him. The hunters nodded, already forming teams, arguing over who'd take which territory. Dogs strained at their leashes, eager to begin. They marched out in waves, starting that evening and continuing through the night. Fresh teams every few hours, moving systematically through different sections of the swamp. Clark watched them go, that cold feeling in his chest spreading to his limbs. The first 24 hours passed with no word. Not unusual. The swamp was vast, and communication difficult. But as the second day wore on, unease began settling over the plantation. No reports, no sightings, No captured fugitive brought back in triumph. Clark paced the yard, unable to sleep, unable to eat. Other overseers tried to maintain normal routines, keeping the field workers busy, but everyone's attention kept drifting toward the tree line where the hunters had disappeared. On the second night, a commotion erupted near the stables. Clark ran toward the noise and found several men clustered around something on the ground. A hunter, one of the veterans who'd gone out with the third wave. He was crawling, dragging himself forward with his hands, his legs apparently useless. His clothes were torn and soaked. His eyes were wild, unfocused. "Get him inside," Clark ordered. "Someone fetch water." They carried the man to the barn and laid him on a pile of hay. He kept muttering, words tumbling out in a breathless stream that made no sense. Clark knelt beside him. "What happened?" "Where's your team?" The hunter grabbed Clark's shirt with surprising strength. He knows the swamp better than the gators, better than anything living. We thought we were tracking him, but he was watching us the whole time. Watching and learning, and where are the others? Gone. All gone. We found markers, followed them, split up to cover more ground. Then Jackson disappeared. Then Cole. Then, the man's voice broke. The trees move for him. I swear the trees move. He's everywhere and nowhere, and how many came back with you? The hunter's eyes focused briefly on Clark's face. Just me. Only me. The others. I heard them calling out. Then silence. Just silence. And those markers he left. Those perfect footprints leading nowhere. Clark felt the blood drain from his face. That was a 10-man team. He took them all. The news spread despite attempts to contain it. By morning, wild rumors filled the plantation. Jonas had supernatural powers, commanded animals, could disappear into thin air. The field workers whispered among themselves, and for the first time in years, some of them smiled when the overseers weren't looking. More hunters failed to return. Then more. The rotating units stopped coming back, and fresh teams refused to enter the swamp without word from those ahead. By the third evening, Silas stood in the yard surrounded by nervous overseers and remaining hunters who'd refused to deploy. His face was pale, jaw clenched. A messenger arrived on horseback, a local farmer who'd been watching the swamp's edge. He dismounted slowly, reluctant to deliver his news. "Well?" Silas demanded. The farmer removed his hat and twisted it in his hands. "I've been counting the men who went in, keeping track of who came back." "And?" "All 100 men," the farmer said quietly. "None of them came back." Silence fell over the plantation yard. The messenger stood fidgeting with his hat, while Silas Holt's face turned the color of ash. Around them, the remaining overseers exchanged glances, each one waiting for someone else to speak first. "That's impossible," Silas finally said. His voice came out thin, strained. 100 men don't just vanish. I kept count, sir. Watched every group go in. Been waiting 3 days for someone, anyone, to come back out." The farmer's hands trembled slightly. "Only that one fellow dragged himself out 2 nights ago, and he ain't made sense since." Clark felt the cold certainty settle deeper into his bones. He'd known something was wrong from the moment he saw those shackles lying open. Now everyone else was finally catching up to what he'd understood in the swamp. Jonas Holt wasn't running. He never had been. But what Clark didn't know, what none of them could know, was what Jonas had been preparing for months before his chains fell open. Deep in the swamp, where cypress roots twisted into natural corridors and Spanish moss hung so thick it blocked the moonlight, Jonas Holt knelt beside a narrow channel of flowing water. His hands moved steadily, adjusting stones to direct the current toward a hidden reservoir. Beside him, an older woman named Maroa watched his work with quiet approval. "The water flows clean now," she said. Her voice carried the weight of years, soft but certain. "The children can drink without fear." Jonas nodded. not looking up from his task. Need 3 more channels like this. Spread them out so if one gets discovered, the others stay hidden. You've thought of everything. Not everything. Not yet. Jonas sat back on his heels, studying the water's movement. But I'm learning. The maroon settlement lay scattered across a section of swamp that most hunters would pass right through without seeing. Shelters built low to the ground, covered with living moss and branches that grew naturally around them. Cooking fires so carefully managed their smoke, dispersed before rising above the tree line. Paths that looked like animal trails, unless you knew exactly where to step. Jonas had found this place 6 months earlier, stumbling onto it while running an errand for the plantation that took him near the swamp's edge. He'd expected to find nothing but water and trees. Instead, he'd found Maroa and 15 others who'd escaped over the years, building something impossible. A home where no home should exist. They'd been suspicious at Jonas wore chains, arrived in daylight, could easily be a trap. But he'd sat down slowly, hands visible, and spoken carefully. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just need to know if what I'm seeing is real. Maroa had studied him for a long time before responding. Depends on what you think you're seeing. People living free. Then, it's real. Over the following months, Jonas had returned whenever possible. Stolen hours, careful visits that left no trace. He'd mapped routes through the swamp, memorizing every twisted path and hidden clearing, helped dig channels for clean water, learned which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. The Maroons had taught him everything: how to move silently through shallow water, how to read weather in the way moss grew, how to disappear even when someone was looking right at you. And Jonas had taught them what he knew: the patterns of plantation patrols, the schedules of supply wagons, the locations of safe houses run by sympathetic souls. Information traded back and forth until the day Jonas finally decided the time was right. Now, 3 days after leaving his chains behind, Jonas sat in the center of the Maroon camp, surrounded by gear the hunters had abandoned. Rifles, packs, canteens, boots, everything organized by type, laid out like pieces of a puzzle he was slowly solving. Darius crouched beside him, young and eager, studying the equipment with intense focus. They all carry the same kind of rifle, same powder horns. Means they're supplied by the same source, Jonas said. Probably bought in bulk, cheaper that way. Look at the boots. Darius examined several pairs. Worn the same way. Left heel always more damaged than the right. They walked the same, trained the same. Military background, most of them. Jonas picked up a compass from one of the packs, and they relied too much on tools instead of instinct. That's exploitable. Around them, other Maroons were gathering. Families mostly, parents with quiet children who'd learned early that noise meant danger. Elders who carried the scars of previous escapes. Young men and women who'd found their way here through luck and desperation. 23 people total now. 24, counting Jonas. Maroa moved through the group, offering reassurance, touching shoulders gently. Her presence steadied everyone. Jonas had learned quickly that she was the community's foundation, the one they turned to when fear threatened to overwhelm hope. Show them, Maroa said quietly to Jonas. Show them how we survive what's coming. Jonas stood, and the murmuring conversations fell silent. Everyone's attention focused on him with an intensity that still felt strange. He'd spent 10 years avoiding attention, becoming invisible. Now, these people looked at him like he held answers to questions they'd been asking their entire lives. The hunters came in groups, Jonas began. 10 men each, rotating schedules, trying to cover ground systematically. They failed because they didn't understand the swamp, and they didn't understand us. He gestured to the arranged gear. But more will come. That's certain. So we prepare. Over the next hour, Jonas outlined fortifications, natural camouflage that would make their shelters completely invisible from even a few feet away, water traps that would slow pursuers without obviously being traps, communication signals using bird calls and specific branch arrangements. "We don't fight unless there's no other choice," Jonas said firmly. "Fighting draws attention, creates noise, leaves evidence. We disappear. We redirect. We make them doubt what they're seeing until they give up and leave." For 2 days, the Maroons trained under Jonas's guidance. He taught counter-tracking, how to walk backward in your own footprints, how to use branches to erase marks from soft ground, how to move through water without creating ripples. He showed them disguise techniques, layering mud and moss until a person standing still became indistinguishable from a tree trunk. They practiced night navigation, learning to read stars through breaks in the canopy, to feel temperature changes that indicated clearings or water ahead. Small victories emerged. A young woman named Sarah successfully led 3 others through a complex route that looped back on itself without leaving any trace. 2 brothers demonstrated perfect bird call communication across 100 yards of dense growth. Even the children learned to move silently, turning it into a game that made them giggle quietly when they thought no adults were listening. Jonas watched it all, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Hope, maybe, or the dangerous beginning of believing this might actually work. One evening, as twilight turned the swamp into shadows and silver light, Jonas sat near the carefully managed fire pit. The flames were small, controlled, producing almost no smoke. Around him, people ate together, shared quiet conversations, touched each other with easy affection that spoke of chosen family. Moreau settled beside him, her movements careful with age. "You're thinking about the future. Thinking we might have one," Jonas admitted. "If we're careful, if we plan right." He paused. "There are routes north, safe houses, people who help. We could move everyone eventually, get far enough away that no plantation owner could reach us. You'd lead us there? If you'd follow." Moreau smiled, lines deepening around her eyes. "We already are." A child's laugh cut through the evening air. Genuine, unrestrained. Jonas turned and saw 3 young ones playing near one of the shelters, supervised by their mother. The sound was so pure, so unmarked by fear, that it stopped conversation throughout the camp. Everyone listened to that laugh, remembered what freedom sounded like. Then Darius came running through the trees, breathless and urgent. He stopped in front of Jonas, chest heaving. "Jonas, there's smoke at the edge of the swamp. More men are coming." The camp went silent. Every face turned toward Jonas, waiting. Jonas rose slowly, his expression calm but his mind already calculating, already planning. He'd known this moment would arrive, had prepared for it. But preparation and reality were different things. "How many?" he asked quietly. Darius swallowed hard. "I couldn't count them all, but there's a lot. And they're carrying torches." The gray light of dawn barely penetrated the canopy when Jonas assembled the scouting party. 4 people. Himself, Darius, a woman named Ruth who moved quieter than wind, and Marcus, an older man whose years of hunting experience made him invaluable. They carried nothing that might reflect light or make noise. Every step was deliberate. Jonas led them through paths he'd memorized during months of careful study. The swamp belonged to him now in ways it never could to outsiders. He knew which fallen logs would hold weight and which would crack, which pools were shallow enough to cross, and which dropped suddenly into depths that could swallow a man whole. The knowledge sat in his body like a second language. Automatic, unconscious. They reached the swamp's eastern edge just as the sun broke over distant trees. What Jonas saw made his breath catch. Not bounty hunters, not plantation trackers with dogs and overconfidence. Militia. Dozens of them, maybe more. Uniformed soldiers in practical gray and brown, moving in organized formations that spoke of training and discipline. They carried proper rifles, not the hunting weapons bounty hunters preferred. Engineers walked among them, studying the terrain with careful attention, making notes, pointing at specific features of the landscape. These men knew swamp warfare. Jonas watched from his concealed position as officers directed troops to specific locations. Axes emerged. Within minutes, soldiers began cutting systematic paths through the vegetation. Not random hacking, but measured clearing that created straight sight lines and eliminated natural cover. Torches were lit despite the morning light. Not for illumination, for burning. Sweet mercy, Marcus whispered beside Jonas. They're going to smoke us out. Not yet, Jonas said quietly, watching the patterns emerge. They're establishing perimeter first, creating controlled access points. They want to know every way in and out before they start the real push. Darius leaned closer. How long do we have? Jonas studied the troop movements, counting units, estimating numbers. 2 days, maybe 3. They'll fortify their position first, make sure we can't slip past them. Then they'll tighten the ring. Ruth's hand trembled slightly against the tree trunk she braced against. We can't fight that many. No, Jonas agreed. We can't. So we don't. They observed for another hour, gathering information. Jonas noted rotation schedules, weak points in the perimeter, patterns in officer movements. The militia worked with brutal efficiency, every action purposeful, every soldier following orders without hesitation. These weren't men who would panic at strange sounds or abandon equipment at the first sign of difficulty. When they'd seen enough, Jonas led the party back through hidden routes that wouldn't expose their location. The return journey felt heavier somehow. The weight of what they'd witnessed pressed down on everyone. The maroon camp came into view near midday. People looked up as Jonas and his scouts emerged from the trees, faces tight with worry. Everyone had spent the night barely sleeping, listening to distant sounds of chopping and organized movement. They knew something bad was coming. Seeing Jonas's expression confirmed their fears. Moreau stepped forward. Show me. Jonas gathered everyone in the camp's center, away from the edges where sound might carry. 23 faces watched him with varying degrees of fear, hope, and desperate trust. Children clung to their mothers. Elders sat with hands clasped tight. State militia, Jonas said simply. Maybe 40 soldiers, possibly more. Trained, equipped, and organized. They're establishing a perimeter around this section of swamp. In 2 or 3 days, they'll start pushing inward. Silence greeted this news. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then voices erupted. Questions overlapping. Fear spilling out in words that tumbled over each other. How did they find us? We have to run. Where would we even go? They'll kill us all. Jonas raised his hand. The gesture was small, but carried enough quiet authority that conversation died. We stay hidden. We prepare escape routes, and we don't panic. Don't panic? A young man named Jacob stood up, shaking. There's 40 trained soldiers out there with guns and axes and they still don't know exactly where we are, Jonas interrupted calmly. They know we're somewhere in this region, but the swamp is vast, and we know it better than they ever will. Moreau's steady voice joined his. Jonas is right. Fear will kill us faster than militia. We listen. We prepare. We survive. The authority in her words settled some of the immediate panic, but tension remained thick in the air. Jonas could feel it pressing against his skin, the collective fear of people who'd fought so hard for freedom, now facing the possibility of losing everything. Over the next 48 hours, Jonas worked tirelessly. He barely slept, moving constantly between fortification projects and strategic planning. With Marcus and Ruth, he strengthened existing camouflage until their shelters became completely invisible from even arm's length away. He prepared decoy camps in 3 different locations, each with subtle signs of habitation that would draw attention away from the real settlement. Darius helped him map escape routes, multiple paths that would allow different groups to scatter in different directions if the militia broke through. They cached supplies along these routes: water, dried food, basic tools, everything someone would need to survive for days while moving toward safer territory. At night, Jonas studied the militia's rotation patterns, timing their movements, identifying the brief windows when perimeter sections were less heavily guarded. He taught this information to others, making sure everyone knew the schedules. But internal tensions continued rising. Arguments broke out over strategy. Some Maroons wanted to flee immediately, insisting that staying was suicide. Others wanted to fight, to make the militia pay for every inch of ground. Jonas found himself mediating constantly, holding everyone together through firm resolve and patient repetition of the plan. "We survive by being smarter, not stronger," he said again and again. "We disappear when they push. We wait when they search. We outlast them." On the second night, exhaustion finally caught up with Jonas. He sat near the concealed fire pit, head in his hands, while the camp settled into tense silence around him. People tried to sleep. Most failed. The sounds of distant axes and organized movement carried through the darkness like a countdown. Lena approached quietly, settling beside him. She'd been invaluable over the past 2 days, keeping families calm, tending to children who didn't fully understand why the adults were so frightened. Her presence steadied Jonas when doubt threatened to overwhelm him. "You need rest," she said gently. "Later." "Jonas!" I said later. Lena fell silent, but she didn't leave. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the swamp's night sounds, frogs, insects, water moving through channels. Then Lena's posture shifted. She was looking toward the camp's edge, eyes narrowed. "Who's that?" she whispered. Jonas followed her gaze. Through the shadows and dim starlight filtering through the canopy, he could just make out a figure moving carefully away from the shelters. Someone small, young, trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. Ezekiel. Jonas's breath caught. The anxious young man who'd arrived at the camp only 3 weeks earlier, still terrified, still adjusting, who flinched at loud sounds and struggled with the constant pressure of hiding. Lena started to rise. "Should we?" "Wait," Jonas said, though his instincts screamed otherwise. He watched Ezekiel slip between trees, heading toward the swamp's edge, toward where militia patrols would be. Jonas didn't see him leave. His exhaustion, the demands of the past 2 days, the weight of 23 lives pressing on his shoulders, it all created a moment of distraction. By the time Jonas stood to follow, Ezekiel had vanished into the darkness. Early dawn broke pale and gray over the swamp, revealing what Jonas had feared. Ezekiel's sleeping spot lay empty, bedding pushed aside in haste, personal items scattered as if abandoned mid-panic. Jonas stared at the vacant space, exhaustion giving way to cold dread. Lena appeared at his shoulder. "He's really gone." "When?" Jonas kept his voice level despite the weight crushing his chest. "Sometime after midnight. I should have woken you immediately, but I thought—" Her voice cracked. "I thought maybe he just needed space, needed to think." Jonas closed his eyes briefly, forcing down the anger that wanted to surface. Anger wouldn't help. Anger wouldn't fix this. "Get Darius! Now!" Minutes later, Darius arrived breathless, already understanding from Jonas's expression that something terrible had happened. Jonas explained in clipped sentences, Ezekiel missing, last seen heading toward the perimeter, hours gone. "We track him," Darius said immediately. "If he's still out there—" "He is," Jonas interrupted. "Question is whether he's alone or if he's already done what I think he's done." They moved quickly, leaving the camp under Moreau's supervision, with strict instructions that no one else leave the perimeter. Jonas and Darius followed the faint trail Ezekiel had left. Broken undergrowth, disturbed moss, the occasional footprint pressed into soft earth. The young man had tried to be quiet, but lacked the skills to truly hide his passage. The trail led east, directly toward where militia patrols operated. Jonas's jaw tightened with each step. He tried to tell himself there might be innocent explanations. Maybe Ezekiel had panicked and fled blindly. Maybe he'd gotten lost trying to scout on his own. But Jonas knew better. He'd seen that particular kind of fear before. The fear that made promises of protection sound like salvation. The fear that whispered surrender might be safer than resistance. They tracked for 2 hours, moving through increasingly dangerous territory. The sounds of militia activity grew louder. Axes biting wood, voices calling instructions, organized movement that spoke of military precision. Then Darius stopped abruptly, pointing. A small clearing ahead showed recent disturbance, cattails broken in a pattern that suggested multiple people standing together. Boot prints in the mud, not just Ezekiel's worn-through shoes, but military-issue boots. Heavy impressions from men who'd stood in one place for several minutes, and scattered on the ground, partially hidden beneath leaves. Military ration wrappings. Jonas picked one up, still slightly damp from morning dew, fresh. Less than 6 hours old. He met them, Darius breathed. He actually… Yes. Jonas dropped the wrapper, looking at the boot prints. 2 militia scouts based on the pattern. They'd waited here deliberately, likely responding to some signal. Ezekiel would have been terrified, starving, desperate for any promise that the nightmare could end. The scouts had given him food, listened to his information, then sent him back toward the camp, or more likely, told him to stay hidden while they reported to their commanding officer. Jonas studied the ground with practiced eyes, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken vegetation. The scouts had left heading southwest, back toward the main militia encampment, moving quickly, carrying urgent information. How long? Darius asked quietly. They know our general location now. Maybe not exact position, but close enough. Jonas straightened, calculating. 3 hours since this meeting. 2 hours for them to report and organize a response. 1 hour before they move on us. Less. They ran back toward camp, abandoning stealth for speed. Jonas's mind worked through possibilities, searching for options that didn't end in capture or death. The refuge's location was compromised. Even if they relocated immediately, the militia now knew roughly where to concentrate their search. They burst into camp to find everyone already gathering. News had spread somehow, that terrible intuition people developed when survival depended on reading signs others missed. Meroa met Jonas's eyes. How bad? Bad. Within minutes, Jonas's fears were confirmed. Distant shouts echoed through the swamp, closer than they'd been that morning. The organized sound of many men moving in coordinated formations. Then something worse, the acrid smell of smoke. Jonas climbed the nearest tall tree, ascending quickly to get a clear view. What he saw made his stomach drop. Militia forces had begun a controlled burn on the swamp's outer ring. Flames licked through dry undergrowth in a deliberate pattern, creating a moving wall of fire that would drive anyone hiding deeper into the swamp's center, exactly where the main militia force waited. They were being herded. Jonas descended and found every face in camp turned toward him, waiting for the words that would either save or doom them. "The refuge is compromised," he said clearly. No point softening the truth. "Militia knows we're here. They're using fire to flush us toward their main force." Panic rippled through the group. Someone sobbed. Children clutched their mothers tighter. Jonas raised his voice, cutting through the fear. "We evacuate. Now! Leave anything that isn't essential. Meroa, Ruth, Lena, help families pack only what they can carry. Marcus, Darius, with me. We need stalling tactics." "Stalling won't," someone began. "Stalling buys time," Jonas interrupted firmly. Time to move children safely. Time to scatter our trail. Time to think. The community exploded into controlled chaos. People grabbed precious items, family heirlooms, tools, dried food. Jonas hated seeing them abandon the homes they'd built with such care and hope. Handcrafted shelters that had meant safety, gardens that had promised a future. But things could be rebuilt. Lives couldn't. Jonas worked alongside Marcus and Darius, creating false trails leading away from their planned evacuation route. They scattered equipment in multiple directions, lit small fires in locations that would confuse pursuit, disturbed vegetation in patterns suggesting larger groups moving in wrong direction. The smoke thickened. Flames crept closer, crackling through undergrowth with hungry efficiency. Militia voices echoed nearer, coordinated and methodical. Jonas moved through camp one final time, checking every shelter, every hiding spot, every corner where a frightened child might conceal themselves. He found an elderly woman named Sarah struggling with her pack. "Too heavy," Jonas said gently, taking it from her. He removed half the contents, keeping only essentials. "I'll carry the rest. But we survive first. We retrieve later." By mid-afternoon, everyone stood gathered at the camp's edge, ready to move but terrified to take that first step into unknown territory. Smoke hung thick in the air. The fire's roar grew louder. Militia voices called instructions, closer than ever. Jonas did a final head count. 23 faces, including children. Everyone accounted for. Everyone except Ezekiel. Night fell with cruel suddenness, the way it did in the swamp when smoke obscured the sun's final light. Flames reflected against terrified faces, turning familiar features into masks of orange and shadow. Children cried softly. Adults stood frozen between the approaching fire and the unknown darkness ahead. Jonas positioned himself where everyone could see him. His voice carried calm authority, even as his mind calculated a dozen potential disasters. "Tomorrow, we survive by outthinking them," he said clearly, "not outrunning them." The swamp crackled around them, burning. Sunrise came hidden behind smoke so thick Jonas could barely see 20 feet ahead. The swamp had transformed overnight into something alien. Familiar landmarks obscured by gray haze, the air tasting of ash and burning wood. Birds that normally sang morning greetings stayed silent, fled to cleaner air elsewhere. Jonas moved through the gathered maroons, checking faces, reading exhaustion and fear in equal measure. No one had slept. How could they, with flames advancing and militia voices echoing through darkness? "Children first," Jonas said quietly to Lena. "You lead them through the channel. I'll bring up the rear with the elders." Lena's face showed burns from last night's falling embers, angry red marks across her left cheek where she'd shielded a crying child from sparks. She'd refused treatment, insisting others needed medical supplies more. "The channel's narrow," she said. "The little ones will panic underwater. Then we make it quick. 1 breath, 10 seconds, surface on the other side." Jonas demonstrated the motion. Deep inhale, duck beneath woven reeds, emerge into hidden passage. Practice with them now. 3 times before we commit. While Lena drilled the children, Jonas checked the underwater channel one final time. He'd constructed it months ago during the refuge's early days, weaving living reeds with dead ones to create a screen that looked like natural growth from above. Below the surface, a narrow passage led to a deeper channel that cut through the swamp's heart. The water was dark, tannic from cypress roots, impossible to see through. Jonas dove under, counting strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He surfaced in the hidden channel beyond, gulping air. The passage would work. It had to work. He returned to find children practicing their breathing, some still crying but focused on the task. A small boy named Thomas looked up at Jonas with wide eyes. "What if I can't hold my breath long enough?" Jonas knelt to the boy's level. "Then you grab onto me, and I'll pull you through. But you can do this, Thomas. I've seen you hold your breath longer than 10 seconds playing games. That was different. Only in your mind. Your lungs work the same whether you're playing or escaping." Behind them, militia voices grew louder. Organized shouts suggested they'd reached the refuge's outer perimeter. "Minutes now, not hours." "We move," Jonas said, raising his voice enough for everyone to hear. "Children with Lena first, then Ruth with the mothers, then Maroa with those who need assistance. Darius, Marcus, and Abram. You're with me at the rear." The evacuation began. One by one, children ducked beneath the reed screen, holding breath, disappearing into dark water. Jonas counted seconds for each. 10, 11, 12. A small head popped up in the hidden channel beyond. Safe. Another child. 10 seconds. 11, 12. Safe. Thomas went last among the children, grabbing Jonas's hand for courage before ducking under. Jonas felt the boy's fingers squeeze tight, then release as he kicked forward. 13 seconds. 14. Jonas prepared to dive after him when Thomas's head broke the surface beyond, gasping but triumphant. The mothers followed, some carrying infants wrapped in treated cloth that would repel water temporarily. Then the elderly, moving slower, requiring more time underwater. Abram helped an old woman named Sarah through, her arthritic joints struggling with the swimming motion. 15 seconds. 20? 25. Jonas dove after them, finding Sarah panicking underwater, limbs flailing. He grabbed her around the waist, kicked hard, drove both of them through the passage. They surfaced together, Sarah coughing water, but alive. "Thought I was drowning," she gasped. "You were swimming," Jonas corrected gently, helping her to the floating platform he'd constructed in the hidden channel. Felled logs lashed together, covered with moss and hidden beneath a canopy of vines. Behind them, militia forces reached the refuge. Shouts of discovery echoed across water. Organized movement suggested commanders deploying search patterns. Jonas had expected this, planned for it. He'd spent the previous night creating misleading footprints leading in 3 wrong directions, deep impressions suggesting groups fleeing south, east, and west. Each trail led to different hazards, sinkholes disguised with leaf cover, channels that dead-ended in impassable thickets, paths that circled back on themselves. Now he triggered the first trap. A rope pulled from beneath water, releasing a counterweight that dropped a massive cypress branch across one southern trail. The crash echoed loudly. Militia voices oriented toward the sound, forces shifting to investigate. "Keep moving," Jonas whispered to those on the floating platform. Silent. No sound at all. They drifted deeper into the hidden channel, propelled by subtle poles Jonas had positioned underwater. The current carried them north, away from the burning refuge, away from the tightening search pattern. Overhead, the vine canopy concealed their movement from anyone standing on solid ground. But the escape remained grueling. A young girl slipped from Abram's grasp, splashing into water too deep for her height. Abram lunged, catching her leg, pulling her back before current could sweep her away. The girl coughed quietly, terrified but holding back screams that would betray their position. Lena's burns worsened as the day wore on, skin blistering from heat and infection. She pressed wet moss against the wounds, jaw clenched against pain she refused to voice. Jonas made decision after decision, each one critical. When smoke shifted direction, threatening to suffocate those on the platform, he redirected their course using hidden guide ropes. When militia voices approached their position, he created diversions. A thrown rock creating ripples 50 yards south, drawing attention away. The sun crossed overhead, invisible behind smoke. Time became measured in small survivals. Another hour without discovery, another child kept quiet, another elderly person helped through exhaustion. As afternoon faded toward evening, Jonas made his final decision. The refuge must leave no evidence. Every shelter, every tool, every sign of permanent habitation had to vanish. He couldn't allow the militia to understand how organized the Maroons had become, how long they'd been there, how many escape routes existed. He triggered the water trap he'd prepared for this exact scenario. A series of dammed channels released simultaneously, flooding the refuge's center and collapsing the ground near the militia's rear position. The sound suggested catastrophic structural failure, earth giving way beneath men's feet. Shouts of alarm echoed across the swamp, officers calling for retreat from unstable ground. The organized search pattern dissolved into chaos as soldiers scrambled for solid footing. Jonas used the confusion. He guided the floating platform faster now, abandoning stealth for speed. The Maroons moved through deepening channels as darkness fell, putting miles between themselves and the ruined refuge. Hours passed in silence. Children slept despite fear, exhausted beyond consciousness. Adults moved mechanically, too tired for thought, following Jonas's whispered directions without question. Finally, near midnight, Jonas spotted the landmark he'd been seeking. 3 cypress trees grown together, their roots forming a natural archway. Beyond them, the far northern tree line marked the swamp's boundary. "We're here," Jonas whispered. One by one, the Maroons climbed from the floating platform onto dry ground. Mothers carried sleeping children. Elders helped each other up the muddy bank. Darius and Marcus pulled supplies ashore. Jonas waited until every person stood on solid earth before stepping off himself. He did a final count in the darkness. 23 faces, all accounted for. They had lost their home, lost months of careful construction, lost the gardens and shelters that had meant safety and hope. But they hadn't lost their people. Jonas looked back across the dark water toward the distant glow of fires still burning where the refuge had stood. Smoke rose against stars, just beginning to emerge through clearing haze. The forest clearing smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Jonas counted heads again, making sure the number still matched. 23 people sat or lay in various states of collapse among the roots of old-growth trees. Moonlight filtered through branches overhead, casting shadows that moved with the wind. Lena pressed fresh moss against her burns, wincing. A child whimpered nearby until his mother pulled him close, rocking gently. Abram sat with his back against a tree trunk, eyes closed, breathing hard from the night's exertion. Marcus checked the wrappings on an elderly man's swollen ankle. Everyone showed signs of the crossing. Clothes soaked through, skin scraped from underwater passages, faces marked with exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. This was the bone-deep weariness of people who had believed themselves safe, only to watch that safety burn. Jonas stood in the center of the clearing and spoke quietly but firmly. "We need to talk about what happens next." Several faces turned toward him. Others kept staring at the ground. "The militia won't stop searching," Jonas continued. "They know we escaped the fire. They'll expand their search pattern, check every possible hiding place within a day's walk of the refuge. Then we're done," someone muttered from the darkness. Jonas recognized the voice. Samuel, a man who'd joined the Maroons only 3 weeks earlier. "They'll hunt us down one by one." "Not if we move smart," Jonas said. "Not if we stay together." "Together?" Samuel stood, anger rising in his voice. "Together is what got us found. Ezekiel knew where we were because we stayed together. If we scatter, we lose everything that made us strong." Jonas met Samuel's eyes steadily. "The refuge worked because we shared knowledge, shared resources, shared watch duties. Alone, you're just one person trying to survive in hostile territory. Together, We're a community that knows how to disappear. Where do you suggest we go? Maroa asked. The elder's voice carried weight that made others listen. The swamps are burned. The forests are patrolled. The towns will turn us in for reward money. Jonas had been thinking about this question since yesterday's fire. He'd studied maps in the overseer's office years ago, memorizing topography during the brief moments when Clark left documents unattended. He'd listened to travelers' stories, absorbed details about regions beyond plantation territory. North, Jonas said, to the foothills. That's weeks of travel, Darius objected. We have children, elderly, injured. We can't move that fast. We move at night. Rest during day in concealed locations. Follow abandoned logging roads that don't appear on official maps anymore. Jonas gestured north, toward distant mountains invisible in darkness. The foothills have caves, natural shelters, streams that run year-round. The terrain is difficult enough that patrols stay in valleys. We can build something new there. You're asking us to trust you again, Samuel said bitterly. Trust you to lead us somewhere safe. But the last place you said was safe got burned down around us. The accusation hung in the air. Jonas felt its weight, knew it reflected fear more than genuine blame, but also knew it needed addressing. You're right, Jonas said simply. I told you the refuge was secure. I believed it was secure. I was wrong. Silence followed his admission. But I wasn't wrong about everything, Jonas continued. I wasn't wrong about the escape routes I planned. I wasn't wrong about the water channels that got us out alive. I wasn't wrong about staying calm when panic would have killed us all. He looked around the clearing, meeting eyes one by one. I can't promise you safety. No one can promise that. But I can promise you, I'll use everything I know to keep us moving, keep us hidden, and keep us together until we reach land where we can build again. Not a temporary refuge this time. A permanent home. Lena spoke up, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. The foothills are Cherokee territory. They might not welcome us. They might not, Jonas agreed. But they also have no love for the militia, and they understand what it means to be pushed from your land. He paused. We'll approach carefully, respectfully. We'll trade labor for permission to settle. We have skills, tracking, building, farming. We have value beyond just being fugitives. And if they refuse? Marcus asked. Then we keep moving until we find somewhere that doesn't refuse. Canada, if necessary. Mexico, if that's what it takes. But we don't stop trying. Jonas pulled out a rough map he'd drawn on treated leather, markings barely visible in moonlight. Here's how we travel. We move in groups of 5, staggered by quarter-mile intervals. Front group scouts for patrols. Middle groups carry children and supplies. Rear group watches for followers. If anyone spots danger, 3 bird calls, 1 long, 2 short. Everyone freezes until the all clear. He traced the route with his finger. Tomorrow night, we follow this old logging road. It's overgrown now, hasn't been used in years. Runs parallel to the main road, but stays hidden in tree cover. We cross the shallow river at this ford where the current runs slow. Then we rest in an old hunter's blind I saw marked on Clark's maps years ago. What about food? Someone asked. We forage as we travel. Wild onions, cattail roots, whatever small game we can trap quietly. No fires until we're 3 days away from militia range. Cold camps only. What about the children? A mother asked, clutching her young daughter close. They can't walk all night without crying. We carry the youngest in rotation. Adults take turns. No one carries alone longer than an hour. Jonas looked at the mother directly. Your daughter's survival depends on all of us, and our survival depends on her silence. Can you help her understand that? The mother nodded slowly, uncertain but willing to try. Rest now, Jonas said. We have 2 hours before we need to move. Sleep if you can. Eat whatever food you carried out. Drink water, but ration it. The next water source is 6 miles north. People settled into uneasy rest. Some slept immediately. Exhaustion, overwhelming fear. Others sat awake, staring into darkness, processing everything they'd lost. Jonas didn't sleep. He sat at the clearing's edge, watching the southern horizon, where smoke still rose faintly against stars. His mind ran through contingencies, backup plans, alternate routes, if the primary path proved blocked. Darius joined him after a while. "You really think we can make it to the foothills?" "I think we don't have better options." "That's not the same as thinking we'll make it." Jonas was quiet for a moment. "No, it's not." They sat together in silence as the night deepened around them. An owl called from somewhere in the forest. Wind rustled through pine branches. Normal sounds of a forest at night, undisturbed by human presence. 2 hours passed. Jonas rose, stretched muscles stiff from the night's swimming and pulling and constant motion. He woke people gently, helped gather the few supplies they'd managed to carry from the refuge. The march north began in darkness. 23 people moving like ghosts through forest shadows. They followed Jonas's planned route exactly. The old logging road appeared where he'd predicted, overgrown with ferns and young saplings, but still passable for careful travel. They moved in staggered groups, maintaining spacing, communicating through hand signals and soft bird calls. Children walked between adults, hands held tight. The youngest rode on shoulders or were carried in slings fashioned from torn clothing. When one child started to whimper, Jonas was there immediately, kneeling down, speaking quietly about the stars overhead, turning fear into wonder just long enough for the moment to pass. They crossed the shallow river at the ford Jonas had identified. Water ran cold and clear, barely knee-deep in most places. Everyone drank their fill, knowing the next water source lay hours away. As dawn approached, they reached the old hunter's blind Jonas had mentioned. A rough shelter built into a hillside, camouflaged with branches and moss, abandoned long enough that new growth partially concealed its entrance. People crawled inside, grateful for any shelter after the night's exposure. The space was cramped but dry. Jonas posted watch rotations, insisting everyone sleep except those on guard duty. He took first watch himself, sitting just inside the entrance where he could see the approach path. His eyes felt heavy, body demanding rest, but his mind wouldn't quiet. Too many variables to track, too many things that could go wrong. He allowed himself to close his eyes for just a moment. The sound of distant horns jerked him awake. Jonas's heart hammered as he identified the direction. South, maybe 2 miles away, but moving closer. Militia horns signaling position to other units, coordinating search patterns in the pre-dawn darkness. He turned to wake the others, knowing their brief rest had just ended. Jonas moved through the cramped hunter's blind, touching shoulders, speaking names quietly. People woke with the instant alertness of those who'd learned fear. "Militia horns," he said simply. "South of us, maybe 2 miles. We move now." No one argued. They gathered what little they had. Water skins, bundles of food, children still heavy with sleep. Within minutes, the group was moving again, climbing steadily upward through forest that grew steeper with each step. Jonas led them along a ridgeline that ran parallel to the main valley. The path was narrow, forcing single-file movement, but it kept them hidden from anyone searching the lower elevations. Branches whipped at faces, roots caught feet. Progress was slow, deliberate. The militia horns sounded again, closer now. Jonas counted the intervals between calls, mapping their search pattern in his mind. They were sweeping north in a grid formation, systematic and thorough. But they were searching the valley floor, expecting fugitives to seek easy terrain. Jonas guided the Maroons higher instead. An hour after sunrise, they reached a swift-moving stream that cut across their path. The water ran cold and clear over smooth stones, rushing downhill with enough force to make crossing dangerous. "Everyone stop," Jonas said quietly. He studied the stream carefully. This was exactly what he needed. "We're going to walk in the water," he announced. "Upstream first, then down. Break the scent trail completely." "That water's freezing," Samuel protested. The children will survive cold water. They won't survive dogs." Jonas knelt beside a young boy, maybe 7 years old, who stared at the rushing stream with wide eyes. "Can you be brave for me?" The boy nodded uncertainly. "Good. Hold tight to your mother's hand. The water's loud, but it's not deep. You'll get wet, but you'll be safe." Jonas entered first, gasping as cold water soaked through his clothes. The current pushed hard against his legs, trying to sweep him downstream. He braced himself, reaching back to help others across. One by one, the Maroons entered the water. Jonas had them walk upstream first, wading 20 yards against the current, before turning and walking downstream for nearly a quarter-mile. The dogs would lose the scent completely when the trail ended in running water, unable to distinguish which direction their quarry had traveled. By the time everyone emerged on the far bank, they were shivering violently. Jonas didn't allow rest. He led them directly into a thick briar thicket that formed a natural barrier along the stream's eastern side. "Through here," he instructed. "Jonas, those thorns will slow the soldiers more than they slow us. We know we're going through. They won't know if we went through or around. Every minute they spend deciding is another minute we gain." Jonas pushed into the briars first, accepting the scratches that tore at his skin and clothing. He found narrow gaps between the thickest growth, calling back directions to help others follow his exact path. The briars caught at everything: clothes, hair, skin, but the Maroons pushed through, understanding the strategic value of difficult terrain. They emerged bloodied but moving, the briar thicket now a formidable barrier between them and pursuit. The sky darkened as morning progressed. Heavy clouds rolled in from the west, promising rain. Jonas felt hope stir in his chest. Rain would wash away footprints, muffle sounds, reduce visibility for searchers. He pushed the group harder, knowing the weather was a gift they needed to use fully. Midday brought the rain, steady, soaking, blessed. Water streamed down faces, turned the forest floor to mud, created a curtain of sound that swallowed other noises. Jonas guided them across a rocky hillside where footprints wouldn't register, then through a grove of pine trees whose fallen needles showed no trace of passage. He paused at a cluster of reflective mica stones embedded in an outcropping. Using mud and careful positioning, he created false glints that would catch sunlight once the rain stopped, markers that would suggest campfire reflections to distant observers, drawing attention south while the Maroons continued north. Maroa struggled with the steep terrain, her elderly legs trembling with exhaustion. Jonas positioned himself beside her, offering his arm for support without making it obvious to others. She gripped his forearm with surprising strength. "This old body wasn't made for mountain climbing," she said between labored breaths. "Your old body made it through worse than mountains," Jonas replied. "It survived everything the plantation threw at it. It'll survive this too. You speak with certainty you don't feel." Jonas smiled slightly. "You taught me that skill. Speaking calm when I feel chaos." A child began crying somewhere in the line, tired, wet, frightened. Jonas moved back immediately, kneeling beside a girl no more than 5 years old. Her mother looked apologetic, exhausted, unable to soothe her daughter's fear. "Do you know what lives up in these mountains?" Jonas asked the girl gently. She shook her head, tears streaming down muddy cheeks. "Eagles," Jonas said. "Birds so big they can see everything below them. And you know what eagles do when it rains?" Another head shake. "They fly above the clouds where the sun still shines. They know the rain doesn't last forever. They know if they're patient and strong, they'll see clear sky again." He touched her small hand. "You're like an eagle." You're climbing through the rain, but you're going somewhere the sun still shines." The girl's crying softened to sniffles. Jonas stood, nodding to her mother, and returned to the front of the line. They climbed through afternoon, through evening, through the slow fade of daylight. The foothills rose around them, not yet true mountains, but high enough to provide defensive terrain. Jonas searched for shelter, knowing everyone had reached their physical limits. He found it just as full darkness settled. A shallow cave carved into a limestone hillside, its entrance partially hidden by an overhang of rock and the twisted roots of an ancient oak. The opening was narrow, but the interior expanded, providing enough space for everyone to fit if they pressed together. Inside, Jonas directed. "Quickly!" The Maroons filed into the cave, grateful for any respite. The space smelled of damp stone and old leaves, but it was dry and concealed. Jonas posted himself at the entrance, looking back across the valley they'd climbed from. Below, scattered across the lowlands, he could see distant torches, the militia spreading out in search patterns. They were searching south of the Maroons' position, exactly as Jonas had intended. His false markers had worked. The difficult terrain had worked. The rain had worked. The Maroons were higher, hidden, and temporarily beyond pursuit. Jonas allowed himself to breathe fully for the first time since yesterday's fire. Lena appeared beside him, wrapping a piece of dry cloth around her shoulders. She'd been burned during the escape, skin blistered along her arm, but she hadn't complained once during the entire journey. "Are we safe?" she asked softly. Jonas considered the question honestly. They weren't safe in any absolute sense. They would never be truly safe while they remained in territory where laws made them property rather than people. But they were safer than they'd been in days. "We're safer than we've ever been," he answered. Outside, rain continued falling, steady and cleansing. The sound of it hitting stone and leaf created a rhythm that filled the silence. Below in the valley, torchlights moved slowly through darkness, searching in all the wrong directions. The rain would continue through the night, washing away the last traces of their passage, extinguishing the final remnants of pursuit. 3 months had transformed everything. The Appalachian foothills stretched green and endless, ridge after ridge of forest and stone rising toward distant peaks. Hidden among these ridges, tucked into a narrow valley where 3 streams converged, the Maroons had built something impossible, a home that existed outside the world, that refused them humanity. Jonas stood at the valley's edge, surveying what they had created. Terraced gardens climbed the southern slope in careful steps, each level carved from hillside and reinforced with stone. Squash vines sprawled across rich soil. Bean plants climbed wooden stakes. Corn grew in neat rows, stalks already waist-high despite the short growing season. The Maroons had learned to use the mountain's natural drainage, channeling water from springs above to irrigate each terrace level. Nothing was wasted. Every drop of water served a purpose before flowing to the next level below. Cabins dotted the valley floor, built low and blended into landscape. Walls of stacked stone supported roofs covered with sod and moss, making structures nearly invisible from any distance. Smoke from cooking fires filtered through carefully designed vents that dispersed the smell and reduced visible plumes. Walking through the settlement felt like moving through a living part of the forest, rather than entering human construction. The natural springs provided constant fresh water, cold, clear streams that bubbled from limestone rock and collected in pools the Maroons had carefully expanded and lined with clay. Children played at the largest pool's edge, laughing as they splashed water at each other under the watchful eyes of mothers who sat nearby mending clothes. Jonas watched those children and felt something shift in his chest, an unfamiliar lightness. This was what survival looked like when it moved beyond mere endurance. This was what happened when people had time to build instead of run, to plant instead of hide, to laugh instead of whisper in constant fear. Darius appeared on the path below, climbing toward Jonas with the easy confidence of someone who had finally found his place. The young man had grown in the 3 months since the swamp burning, not just in skill, but in presence. He moved like someone who belonged to this land. "Lookout points are finished," Darius reported, slightly breathless from the climb. "4 positions covering all the approaches. We can see anyone coming from 2 miles out. Easy." Jonas nodded approval. "Show me the sight lines later. I want to make sure there are no blind spots. Already checked twice. Lena made me." Darius grinned. "That woman doesn't trust anything until she's verified it 3 ways herself. That's what keeps us alive." They walked together down the path toward the settlement's center, where Maroa sat with a circle of children telling stories. Her voice carried through the valley, rich and rhythmic, weaving tales of ancestors who had survived impossible journeys. The children listened with rapt attention, some young enough that this settlement was the only home they'd ever known outside captivity. Jonas paused to listen. "And your grandmother's grandmother," Maroa was saying. "She walked 200 miles with a baby on her back and determination in her heart. When the river rose too high to cross, she didn't turn back. She found a way. When the dogs came close, she didn't panic. She climbed. Your blood carries that strength. Never forget it." One child raised a small hand. "Elder Maroa, will we have to walk 200 miles? No, child. You get to stay right here and grow strong." Maroa's weathered face creased with a smile. "That's what all those journeys were for. So you could have roots instead of running shoes." Jonas moved on, leaving the children to their lesson. Further into the settlement, he found Lena conducting school beneath a wide oak tree. 7 children sat on logs arranged in a semicircle, practicing letters scratched into bark with charcoal. Lena pointed to each letter, having the children repeat sounds. She looked up as Jonas approached, and her face brightened. The burn on her arm had healed to a pale scar, a permanent reminder of the swamp fire. She wore it without shame. "They're learning fast," she said proudly. "Little Moses already knows his full alphabet." A small boy beamed at the recognition. Jonas knelt beside the group. "What's the most important thing about learning letters?" The children looked uncertain. "It means the words belong to you," Jonas continued. "Nobody can tell you what something says and have you just believe them. You can read it yourself. You can know truth from lies." "Can you teach us numbers too?" a girl asked. "Lena's better at numbers than me," Jonas admitted. "But yes, you'll learn everything you need to build whatever life you want." A commotion near the valley entrance drew his attention. Jonas rose, instinctively alert, but relaxed when he recognized the source. New arrivals. 3 adults and 2 children, thin and exhausted, being guided into the settlement by the scouts who had found them wandering the foothills. This happened regularly now. Word had spread through the invisible network that connected the enslaved across the South. Whispers of a safe place in the mountains, a community that took in anyone brave enough to run. The Maroons never turned anyone away. Jonas walked to meet the newcomers, offering water from a leather pouch while Maroa approached to assess their condition. The adults stared at the settlement with disbelief written across their faces. The gardens, the children playing freely, the absence of overseers or chains. "This real?" one man asked, voice hoarse. "Real as anything," Jonas answered. "You're safe here. How long you been here?" 3 months in this location. "But we've been free longer than that." The man's eyes filled with tears he tried to hide. Jonas pretended not to notice, giving him dignity in the moment. Over the following days, Jonas fell into routines that felt almost normal. He taught tracking skills to younger Maroons, showing them how to read animal signs and weather patterns. He helped construct a larger storage building for winter food preservation. He mapped new routes through the mountains, identifying escape paths if the settlement ever needed evacuation. But mostly, he built. He built shelters that would withstand mountain winters. He built trust among people who had learned distrust as survival. He built a future that existed outside the nightmare he'd escaped. Sometimes, late at night, memories returned. The swamp, the hunters who never came back, the fire consuming the refuge. Ezekiel's terrified face the last time Jonas saw him before the young man fled toward false promises of protection. The weight of every decision that had brought them here. Jonas didn't run from those memories. He examined them honestly, understanding that survival had required choices that haunted him. But those choices had also created this: children learning to read, elders teaching freely, families sleeping without fear. The cost had been terrible. The result was worth it. One evening, as sunset painted the ridges gold and crimson, Jonas climbed to the valley's eastern edge, where the wind blew strongest. A young boy followed him, Thomas, maybe 8 years old, quick-minded and endlessly curious. "What are we doing up here?" Thomas asked. "Learning to read the wind," Jonas replied. He wet his finger and held it up, feeling which side dried fastest. He studied how leaves moved in the trees below, noting patterns in their rustling. He showed Thomas how to smell moisture on the air, predicting rain hours before clouds appeared. "The wind tells you everything if you know how to listen," Jonas explained. "It tells you weather coming. It tells you which way smoke will blow from your fire. It tells you how sound will carry." Thomas mimicked Jonas's movements, holding up his own small finger to feel the breeze. "How did you learn all this?" Jonas smiled faintly, looking out across the valley where evening cooking fires were being lit, where families gathered for shared meals, where freedom existed not as distant dream, but present reality. "Freedom starts with knowing which way the world pushes you," he said quietly, "and pushing back harder." The wind rustled through the terraced gardens below, moving across new crops that represented futures reclaimed and lives rebuilt. Thomas stood beside him, small and young and unburdened by chains, learning skills that would keep him free. Jonas breathed deeply, tasting mountain air and possibility. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.